My name's Jonathan Tame. I'm the director of the Jubilee Centre. And for those who are new to us, we're a social reform think tank that offers Christian perspectives on economic, social and political issues. We do that through research, publications, training programs and events such as this one. So today we're going to be looking at the whole question around the housing crisis in Britain. And one of the most obvious aspects of this is the issue of affordability. Now, this problem is not unique in Britain, though. Housing is priced out of reach of young people, especially in many major cities around the world, all the way from London to Sydney, which is where our main speaker actually comes from. So David Corbett is a millennial from Sydney, and he holds degrees in history and finance from the University of Sydney. And he's worked with think tanks, including the Legatum Institute in London, and is a visiting fellow at the PM Glyn Institute in Sydney. He's currently a student at law and training for admission to practice as a solicitor. A year ago, David published his Cambridge paper called Birds Have Nests, Biblical Reflections on the Housing Crisis, and that forms the basis of his talk today. And we're also delighted to have Chris Beales with us, who will be responding to David's presentation. Chris is an Anglican clergyman and social entrepreneur with over 4 decades experience of working in community, economic and social development, and with a particular focus on issues of faith and the economy. He's a member of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Housing, Church and Community, and that commission published its landmark Coming Home report just last month. So we're delighted to have the two of them here. David is going to speak for 20-25 minutes. After that, Chris will make a response for around 10 minutes, and then we will open up the conversation to questions from any of you who are here, and we'll do that via the chat function, which hopefully at the bottom of your screen you can click and put your questions into the chat. Then I will pick them and ask you perhaps to present your question sort of verbally at the time. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome David to come and speak on this issue. Birds Have Nests, Biblical Reflections on the Housing Crisis. David.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for so much for coming. I have a photo of the Rowan estate behind me, and we'll get to that later. In 2008, the famous real estate board game Monopoly came out with a twist. Monopoly for Millennials carried the tagline, "Forget real estate, you'll never afford it anyway." In the same year, Theresa May, in a landmark speech to the Conservative Party conference, said, "Solving the housing crisis is the biggest domestic policy challenge of our generation." Now, since then, when we've been working on this paper, Brexit has come up, COVID has come up, but simmering underneath this has been a domestic crisis, and the aim of this talk is to bring that back into sharp focus. Now, this talk will cover 3 main parts: what has caused the housing affordability crisis, what might the Bible have to say on this issue, and how then should we house? And it has some updates since COVID, which have actually been quite fortunate for this paper in terms of confirming some of its points. So before we delve into it, it's important to understand that this is rather technical. So I've put the bulk of information in the paper, and I'd just like to talk about what's caused it in the simplest terms I can, because I've found it very helpful when I've been explaining it to people. Now, there are 2 main causes of the housing affordability crisis. They're quite separate. The first one is everyone knows when they go to buy a house that they go and they generally get a mortgage, unless they're very fortunate and they've inherited or some other unusual circumstance. Now, what we've seen since the mid-90s is what's euphemistically being called a liberalisation of the mortgage market. Now, I know this can be rather dull, but it's very important. When you go to, when people put down their deposit, they used to have to put down a 20% deposit. And this has gone down to anywhere from 5% to 0%. Now, that might seem like just a small change, but what that's actually mean is people have been able to borrow from 5 times their deposit to 20 times their deposit size. That has led to a huge ballooning in how much has been able to be borrowed for housing. The dynamics of the market, I won't go into it. There are some really dull economic terms, but essentially, house price sellers are price makers and the buyers are price takers. So as much debt as people have been able to borrow has essentially led to the general rise in house prices. This is contrary to what we've been told in much of the mainstream media, and what Theresa May said in her speech, which is the cause is very simple. For too long, we haven't built enough homes. Now, there is a superficial appeal to this approach, but essentially what has driven this has been the increase in access to debt. COVID actually surprised a lot of people that people were expecting a price decline, but because interest rates went down again, house prices have actually on the main gone up. So this has actually been a confirmation of what was the minority view on what's caused house price rises before COVID and is now accepted. The central banks talk about the wealth effect, and they've tried to put a positive spin on this and say, well, this income is being put back into the economy, but essentially it amounts to unearned income. The second driver of the housing affordability problem actually comes from an observation that house prices have not gone up everywhere to the same degree. In fact, some parts of England haven't really gone up at all and have actually declined, which we go into in the paper. This brings up the second driver of house prices, and this is how land appreciates in value. Now, this is often missed. Unfortunately, it used to be mainstream economic thought, but it's very simply explained with a thought experiment. Imagine if you went into the center of London, into the city of London, 100 years ago and bought a piece of land. There's nothing on it, it's just grass. It could take one house, but there's nothing there. You then fell asleep on that piece of land and people built this around you, people built shops, and they made it an attractive place to purchase land. Well, if you wake up 100 years later, your land will be worth a lot more money. Now, that hasn't been by the effort that you've put in, but by the effort of those around you. Now, this is essentially the nub of the housing crisis. Instead of talking about supply and demand, we need to talk about mortgage finance and location. So this is where the housing affordability crisis has really come from. This has caused some issues that people need to go into more research on, but essentially the housing crisis hasn't gone up by effort within the economy, and this has meant that to put it quite directly, the middle class has been getting a small price gain on their house, while very wealthy parts of the housing owners have also got an even larger rise in their house prices. So this has led to a lack of political will to stop the housing affordability crisis. I think it's useful to just mention here that the focus of this paper and the heart behind it is to tackle an issue that is of real concern to everybody from a biblical perspective. The heart of it is not necessarily to just talk about the housing crisis, but the ability of the Bible to speak into an issue that people care about and touches their life. That's why it takes a normative approach, which means how should we structure our society? And it starts to ask questions of whether home ownership is something that we should have at all. And the conclusion is that we should have home stewardship. And I'll go into this. So one point that I might make before I move into the Bible approach to housing is that if we were interested in supply and demand as the cause of the housing crisis, it's very interesting to find that houses per capita in the UK are actually far higher than they were in the 1960s. So this means we have actually more houses than we thought. What this means is that household sizes are getting smaller. Now up to 30% of the UK is single person dwellings. I hesitate to call them households. And just next door in Sweden, 52% of people live alone as adults. This, I think, is a housing crisis in its own right and something that demands a response. Now, it won't lead to an affordability gain in a large, in a material sense, but it is obviously a big problem that I think Christians, we should draw our attention towards. There are some other reasons that people think that have been driving house prices, but I might leave them to later if people want to discuss them. So what might the Bible have to contribute? Now, this is where this was a really interesting project to delve into. It is one way that people can talk about the Bible is to talk about it as a grand narrative about home. This might surprise people, and it's not really in there because home is a word we've come up later. But the Bible does start with what is essentially home in a walled garden, a paradise. Then where humanity is exiled from its home, and the story of the Old Testament has been commented on as a narrative about the land and looking for the homeland. This is taken into the New Testament, where Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth, and the earth and land are the same word. And Jesus talks about, in terms of home, moving to a mansion with many rooms, and that he's going ahead to prepare this for us. The refrain through the Old Testament prophets is for a vine and a fig tree under which every man can lay his head and no one can make him afraid. This talks of a prosperous homeland where there'll be secure tenure. Then when we fast forward to Revelation, we see the home city and the security and prosperity that will provide. So what we can see here is that the Bible does legitimize the desire for secure and stable home in a prosperous land, but it also understands the tension that we live in now. I think there are some applications that we can take from this. The first is what we call hospitality, which is providing that sense of home to people in this land now. The idea of having a hometown seems to come out as that we steward as a reasonable goal to have, and what urban planners call placemaking, but with a biblical flavor. And also when we talk about, when Jesus talks about leaving your home, this seems to frame it more as essentially in today's vernacular as homemaking for these people and home spreading. Because home and the kingdom of God, I think there are a lot of parallels there. So the Bible does seem to legitimize this desire within us. Not necessarily that it'll be totally fulfilled now, but it is a natural desire for secure and stable home in a prosperous land. Then another key interest of the Bible that seems to come through is not much of a focus on housing, but a core thread from page 3 about household and leaving and cleaving and forming a household. This is reaffirmed by Jesus in the New Testament, this created norm of forming a household. Interestingly here, cultures have different approaches to households. The Western model has become one of independence, even to that extreme of living completely alone, like in Sweden, as the norm, over 50%. But the Bible seems to focus throughout on the idea of household and the importance. And there's many texts that we could talk about there. Which are in the paper. Housing is about relationships, not its possible financial gains. And some of the applications here, I think, are co-locating near our extended families, thinking about different built forms such as granny flats or other multi-generational housing. When we think of multi-generational housing, it can be as simple as having a separate kitchen, an entrance, and more than one main bedroom. I think this we'll find is consistent with a lot of the talk about household. And I think that this brings down to the practical element for people to start thinking about. This really came through when I was talking through this paper with Gen Xers, not just thinking about whether they're attracted to other people, but whether they could start a household with them, and really starting to think that through deeply. The paradigm seems to be somewhere between, in the Bible, between dependence and independence. Some cultures have a norm of not leaving home, and so getting married and moving back into the family home. That's the norm in Middle Eastern cultures, for example. And then there's a norm in the Southern European nations of helping children to buy their first home and for them to move straight into a family-ready home. And this Western norm that we seem to be living within is one of independence. It seems, surveying the biblical material, it's somewhere in this complex interdependence where there's new households, but they reinforce one another. They are able to look after, the grandparents are able to look after grandchildren. And I think we really need it seems to say that we need to think much more about where we live than how much money we're going to make out of housing. Another key biblical concept is land. From the beginning, the land was inherited, and this is reinforced in the biblical model in the Jubilee institutional network in Israel. Now, the interesting thing looking at Israel how this worked relationally is that when the Jubilee occurred, the land was freed of debt, and this allowed the land to pass between generations. And it meant every single generation was able to steward land. This meant more than just having a plot of land. It meant every adult Israelite would have the opportunity to run a business, which was a farm in their case, build a house, and to steward a household. So it seems that there is a strong stewardship principle within the Bible, and this is different from ownership. There aren't financial gains from the land directly that go to the Israelites, but there is that ability to steward and to take from the gain from their effort. Taken together, these biblical themes of home, household, and land all seem to strongly support the conclusion that enabling and encouraging people to live in and steward their own houses, households, and hometown are an important part of a biblical vision for a flourishing society. Now, that's the ideal. How can we apply this today? I wanted to first look back quickly at some inspiration. Christians have been involved in the land market and housing for over 500 years. Helen Haywood has a brilliant paper, which is footnoted in the Cambridge paper at 46, that's worth reading. And then other luminaries have included Wilberforce and Shaftesbury, who have advocated for allotments and the ability for people to own their own home. In the case of Shaftesbury, Cadbury and the Lever brothers have built model towns for their workers so they could have the dignity of raising a family as well as working. And then we can still see in London the legacy of the Peabody Trust and the Guinness Trust and the beautiful social housing that they put together. And also there's been other ones such as the Roallan Estate, which has focused on the ability to buy a house but not necessarily own the land. And this is where we can start to focus on other models that aren't just based on ownership but stewardship. So I think that the main heading that responses can come under is stewardship. Of course, first there'll need to be some really complex work done in the debt market, moving to more equity-like products. And I think there is a particular need to watch the financial sector, which is desperate for yield at the moment, pushing for more build to rent, because that is a secure line of dividends for them in a very uncertain world. And we've seen what's happened in Germany because of that. Speaking of Germany, there's whenever you do a paper on housing, people always say, on housing ownership, people always say, well, what about Germany, where half of the people rent? And once you dig below this, you'll see that in Germany, people have a long-term tenure. They have a rolling contract. It's very difficult for them to be evicted. And actually, up until quite recently, the prices were flat. So housing wasn't a place to make money. It was a good place to store your money if you're investing, but it wasn't anything like we have here. And really significantly, the renters, they rent like owners. And this means that, yes, 50% may rent, but 100% of them steward. And this is something that we can really start to think about if we start to be a bit more creative. In Singapore, they have home ownership of 97%, but of course that might slightly fluctuate. But this is built on a 100-year leasehold rather than actual freehold, which is what we think of. So there's ways to think a little bit more creatively here. The focus needs to be on the stewardship, the ability to tenure, to have long-term tenure, control, be able to put a nail in the wall, be able to paint and live in it like a home. And I think that's where we're going to have to start focusing. An example is in the social housing sector. There's a new model called community land trust. Well, it's not new, but it's becoming more popular, where people are in housing estates, but then they ended up running their housing estates themselves. And this actually leads to a lot more feeling of ownership over the place. And it's actually led to it's a very popular model, and it's worth us considering more. The difficulty here is that if we build more community land trusts and asset prices keep rising, we'll start to create an assetless underclass in these estates. So at the same time, it's important to advocate for house prices not to continue rising. In the private rental sector, as the paper notes, it's now more expensive to rent than to repay a mortgage. So most renters are actually paying off their landlord's mortgage and then some, but at the end of the period not getting the house. At the same time in the UK, because of reforms in the 1980s, they've also not had the benefit of tenure security or the ability to live like an owner. And it is really high time for that to change. There is, because of COVID, an opportunity to start talking about this and the importance of a stable base for everybody. So I think this is an opportune moment for that type of advocacy. Now, there was that complex problem about location, and there's only one way to, there's no one way to solve this, but the answer is not to look just about affordability, but to start to talk about what sort of settlements do people like. There's a brilliant paper on relational cities that I highly recommend. The key here, I think, is to start talking in terms of social capital and streets. And Jane Jacobs, the great prophet of urban design, has led that discussion. And finally, it is really important that we start to talk about this housing crisis in terms of single person dwellings. This won't solve the affordability crisis, but it is striking that it's not being discussed in a context where the understanding is that supply and demand are the problem. And that analysis would lead straight to a discussion about why there's housing breakdown. As simple as if people get divorced, there's double the housing need. And this is something that the church is uniquely placed to speak into. I want to talk in conclusion of this deep desire we have for housing, and that is completely understandable. C.S. Lewis, I'll finish with a quote, said, "Apparently then, our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And to be at last summoned inside would be both glory and honor beyond all our merits, and also the healing of that old ache." Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, David. That's just brilliant overview of the affordability crisis and some of the ways we can think about that, especially from a biblical perspective. And so now hand over to Chris Beales, who's going to bring a response to this paper. And while he's speaking, perhaps you'd like to put some questions into the chat for us to attend to in 10 minutes or so. So over to you now, Chris.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, David. That was very stimulating, full of ideas. And I warm to the two main emphases that you've highlighted of home and stewardship. And I fully agree that the answer to the housing crisis is definitely not just building more homes. And you quoted C.S. Lewis. I'd like to just quote an authority as well. This is it. Housing reform is not merely a matter of providing enough homes. The houses must be worthy of the name of home. The comfortless and badly planned house with no garden must be a thing of the past. We must scrap the old standards of house planning and estate development. The whole level must be raised, and with it, the level of home life and of happiness. Richard Rees, The Home I Want, 1918. We're not so different, are we really now? So to make a house into a home, you clearly need community. And David, you emphasized that very well. You set out the values which can be derived from studying and reflecting on the scriptures. And you said a working definition of home from a Christian perspective might be a secure dwelling in which one can live with or near loved ones in a thriving local and broader community and in relationship with God. Now, the Coming Home report, I was part of this Archbishop's Housing Commission, and the theologians on the commission produced 5 really powerful values. They are sustainable, safe, stable, sociable, and satisfying. If you want to know what the good might look like in relation to housing and community, those, they said, are the basic values. And the report, Coming Home, like David has said, gives real attention to the scriptural and theological bases for these values. Now, a friend of mine, a very good friend who I've seen his face on here, so hi there, I shan't say who it is. When I described these values over the phone to him, his first remarks was, well, that sounds a bit like motherhood and apple pie. Now, I have to say, I'm all in favor of motherhood, and apple pie is one of my favorites. So there's nothing wrong in setting out these values. But Coming Home adds a 6th value, sacrificial. And that, of course, applies to the church because our faith and our gospel is rooted in sacrifice, but it applies also to others. And I should just say that one of the major house builders, one of the big volume house builders, when I was talking about these values the other day, the chap I was talking to, who's quite a senior director there, really his jaw was dropping and he said, why didn't we think of these? Why didn't we think of these? And he kept coming back to sacrifice. And I'm hoping that actually this company is going to do some really, really exciting and sacrificial work. Now, let me say, these values have resonated with all kinds of people, and it's great having so many positive responses which have come to us from outside the church to what you might call theology, and what most people think of as being, when you think of the word theology, as being something that doesn't relate to anything of any relevance to anybody. Absolutely wrong, because of course theos has to do with God and logos has to do with word. And a friend of mine once said, in St. John's Gospel, the word was made flesh, but in the church, the word was made minutes. And I think we have a great tendency in church actually not to do anything about these important things. We're very good at analysis. We're very poor at stepping out in faith and making a difference. Which brings me on to stewardship. Now, David, you talked about a stewardship economy, and you cited Germany and Singapore as interesting places where, in the case of Germany, they're quite happy to rent. In the case of Singapore, it's leasehold rather than freehold that they live in the houses of. And you touched on this fraught issue of ownership and private rents, and you called, I think, rather too gently for reform to the buy-to-let model. I think you could be more assertive about that, actually. But we have this problem in the church with the word stewardship, because stewardship in most parishes equals time, talents, and money. But in reality equals, dear members of the congregation, please give more. Now, why does the Church of England, and I can only speak at this point for the Church of England, why does the Church of England not actually steward its resources more responsibly? Because guess what? We have 200,000 acres of land in this country, in England. And if we have 200,000 acres, how come we are generally ignored by so many institutions and organizations and local authorities and others who think that, well, church isn't really relative to what we want to do? because they haven't connected the church with responding to housing need. And I was very struck by a report I read, I think on Sunday, about the census, and an academic from Birmingham or somewhere was saying that when it comes to people recording their religious affiliation, fewer people than ever are going to write Christian. The reason being that from what they can see, the church is either immoral or they're completely indifferent to it. Well, isn't that an absolute scandal? And here, now, with these wonderful assets and resources that we have, we could do something significant to change that situation. So we know that in many dioceses, rural land is actually seen as a problem. It's a drain on the finances. There are complicated tenancies for farmers and all sorts of things. And if you take one of the best dioceses in the country, the Diocese of Gloucester, who actually use their resources really well, the diocese secretary told me the other day that the rural land that they have, the land that's not available for housing development, say, actually the income from it amounts to just about half a stipend for one clergyman. So it really is an issue that needs to be addressed. And thank God, we are now beginning to address this and not before time. So here are some particular practical actions, and I'll be very quick. Firstly, the Church of England has appointed a bishop for housing. Bishop Gully Francis Dehani, she's just become the Bishop of Chelmsford. She's also the Bishop for Housing, and in the summer she'll become a member of the House of Lords. So in her spare time, I'm not sure what she'll be doing. But what this means is that we are taking housing very seriously, and we've got someone who is going to be, if you like, in the lead on that, supported by 4 other bishops and an advisory group and a small executive team led by the head of planning of the Duchy of Cornwall, Nick Pollock. And he's being seconded for 2 days a week to this work. Ben Priest-Smith, the Diocesan Secretary of Gloucester, is being seconded for a day a week. And I'm doing 2 days a week, at least for this year. And what we are focusing on at this stage is really getting to grips with some practical action. The church is great about talk, talk, talk. We'll analyze till the cows come home. Well, we're talking about building homes and making them truly affordable for local people. So that's the challenge. Now, to help us, we've carried out a mapping scheme. We've done a geospatial map of all Church of England owned land and buildings across England. And this has been created for us by Knight Frank, who are one of the leading people in the country on this ArcGIS stuff. And if dioceses are to plan and to work strategically, they really do need to know what resources they've got. And many dioceses actually don't know what land they own. So we'll be able to help them. I should add, it's a complicated process, this, because at least 3,000 plots of land, we discovered, are not actually registered with the land registry. And in some dioceses, I'm afraid to say, some of the land is wrongly registered. So we're working our way through these things, and we're using a research company called IDO to drill down to local level and check out the accuracy of the map in the local parish, and also ask that parish, what do you want to do with your land and buildings? Is there the opportunity to build some affordable homes there? And what are you doing pre-COVID and during COVID to respond to the social needs of your communities, whether it's food banks or nurseries or work with older people or whatever it might be? And we've piloted that particular aspect of the work in Gloucester Diocese and Newham Deanery. Now, we're also addressing the question of best value. For those of you who are lawyers who are interested in charity law, the church has a serious reputational problem. And that is that the lawyers say you cannot sell unless you're making the best price. And if you have to make the best price, it sometimes means you can't do good. For example, last summer, Arkengarthdale in North Yorkshire, an old school owned by the parish church council, decided against huge opposition. The local MP happens to be Rishi Sunak, and a community land trust and many others said, please sell this to the community land trust for £150,000 and we will be able to put in homes for local families. But instead, the lawyers said, go for the best price, and they sold for £180,000 to a couple from Wales who raffled their home in order to be able to move to North Yorkshire. Scandal, actually, it wasn't as simple as that, to be quite honest. That's the way that the press portrayed it. But whatever happened, the reputational damage to the church of that and what's happening in the old deanery in Wells and what's happening to diocesan land in Peterborough and what's happening in Guildford and what's happening in Newbury, and so I could go on. The reputational damage, both in the press and to local communities, is enormous. So we're talking to number 10 in the Charity Commission about a change of law. I think that's a bit further down the road, but more particularly, we're talking to ourselves, the diocese, and saying, let's get our act together. Let's interpret the law in the way which fits with our ministry and mission. And Gloucester Diocese does it to great effect. And the ill-advised dioceses who listen to their lawyers, who take the worst option, I believe now are going to be challenged. And not just challenged, but they're going to be challenged in the General Synod in July in a motion put by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. So we are in for shaking the foundations. And it's really, really exciting to be backed by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, who are determined to see good news and not just the rubbish that we so often get tarred with. So very quickly on, I believe we should partner profusely, because we cannot solve the housing crisis on our own. But a strong emphasis on creating more truly affordable homes, which is what our Coming Home report says, and using our assets to do so, puts down an important marker. And we've been told that there are other landowners who are interested in this. And not just that, there's a movement led by people like Gail Mayhew of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and Ben Bolgar of the Prince's Foundation and Charlie Dugdale and Knight Frank to create a stewardship initiative, which, if you like, will develop into a kite mark for landowners, which will produce high quality, truly affordable, well-mixed, integrated and beautiful and sustainable homes. And this is a challenge that now we in the church want to respond to, and you can read about it in the Coming Home report. This morning, I had a conversation with an organization called Rent Plus, and they provide deposits for people to be able to get onto the housing ladder. And they also provide deposits for people who are saddled with debt, people who've had problems in the past, people who normally couldn't get anywhere near to owning their own home. And they work with housing associations in order to help people onto this ladder. And after a period of time, actually every 5 years, the idea is that the rent that they're paying, which is 80% or whatever, can then be the basis for them moving into buying their own homes. Now, finally, showcase some quick wins is what we've been told. If after a year we're still talking about it and nought's happened, then the money will stop. And we're very serious about this. We can't be hanging around for the slowest tortoise any longer. So we are working alongside and with some terrific initiatives. In Newham, we're working with the diocese on plans for 242 almshouses on 3 church sites with 3 new church and community facilities and a health centre. The almshouses will be for key workers. In Middlesbrough, we're working with the Diocese of York and with the council to develop 50 homes, probably almshouses again. In Gloucester, a redundant church is going to be pulled down and 20 homes for homeless people created. In Houghton Regis near Dunstable, where the churches are planning to build a community centre in a new development, we have brought in Home Group, a big housing association, to partner with us in the building and running of this community centre, and they're going to build supported living units on top of the local centre. And we're working with the GPs and the health service to create a centre for social prescribing. In Cornwall, we've brought the Anglicans and the Methodists together, working with the council and the duchy to create affordable homes. In Harlow, Spire Almshouses are developing the site of an English Lutheran church for homes in Black, and so I could go on. It's just incredible. All over the country, great things are happening because people are saying we are no longer bound by the irrelevance, the sheer irrelevance of so much that the church does. We're going to change the world in the name of Christ. So my challenge to you is, what can you do to help solve the housing crisis and turn what's going to be a strapline into action? And the strapline the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to use in a debate on the Coming Home report in the House of Lords tomorrow. The strapline is a safe, stable and affordable home for everyone.